I just want to just offer up a different formulation, and I think maybe, John, this is where you were going with your story, and maybe the other John as well, which is there's another way to think about this, and this is how the UK did reform. They stopped asking kind of like, what do the corporations owe the countries? And they started asking, well, wait a second, I really want to have my companies have their headquarters here. It's really super valuable to me. And so this is where I think the US is kind of foundering a little bit, which is our logic is you owe us something. The other logic is if our companies stay and are headquartered here, we benefit. And the whole way we think about foreign activity is a little bit screwed up. So the way we think about foreign activity is you go over there to do something, to manufacture, to sell, to do whatever. That means you're not doing it here. And so that's bad. The evidence is actually the opposite. And this is, I think, the really important point. The evidence is the opposite. The evidence is actually when you go abroad, firms who go abroad grow domestically. And so foreign activity is not a substitute, to use the economics language, for domestic activity. It's likely a complement. So once you start to think like that, and once you understand that logic, it takes you into a different place. It takes you to a place where you say, you know what, I actually like it when you grow abroad. I actually think it's important for you to grow abroad, because when you grow abroad, we're going to be doing more R&D at home, we're going to be doing more exports at home, we're going to be doing a whole bunch of stuff.
If you can bring your cash back.
Well, indeed, if you can bring your cash back, absolutely right. But the underlying idea here is we should think about these activities as not being substitutes. It's not a zero-sum game. And if you think about it as a zero-sum game, you're going to say, oh my God, I don't like foreign activity. And actually, I want to penalize it with a worldwide system, and I want to tax it. If you think about it as, wait a second, I like it when my firms succeed abroad. That's a totally different logic, and that takes you to a totally different place. And so the other notion here is to think about economic patriotism as understanding we and corporations domiciled here have a twinned kind of future. And that's, I think, a different way of thinking about it than the way the rhetoric has been actually structured so far. Sorry, Dan, did you want to say something? No. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit of a sideshow, but I think it's important, and I think it's going to become more important. Let me just tell you quickly what happened, and then we'll talk about what maybe broader issues. So, the short version, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there were two pieces that they went after, and they went after pretty hard, I think, and people in the room might have a different point of view. The first thing is they went after they basically went after the offshore cash. Remember those three motivations? I think what they really went after is the offshore cash. And so what seemed particularly gratuitous to them, and I think arguably is you use the offshore cash of Medtronic. Covidien, for example, which is the offshore company in that merger, uses Medtronic's offshore cash to finance the takeover of Medtronic. And that was just a bridge too far for some people. And so what they did is they kind of effectively said so-called hopscotch transactions, where you take that offshore cash and you use it to finance the takeover, is actually not going to be something that's going to be allowed. And I guess specifically, they used a part of the code 956 to try to get around those kinds of hopscotch transactions. The related thing they did is, and I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, is they got at decontrolling transactions. So Medtronic has got a bunch of cash in Ireland, let's say. How do you get at that cash? And the answer is you have Covidien pump in a bunch of money. And so then it no longer is a Medtronic subsidiary. That too they went after. So they went after transactions that were trying to get at offshore cash, and I think they went at them pretty hard in the following sense. I think it sent a chill, and it effectively does put what are at least some current plans are getting scuttled by those kinds of ideas. There's a variety of issues associated with that. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Was it a legitimate regulatory response as opposed to a legislative response? And was the secretary within his bounds to do that? I'm not going to go into that. The second thing is, what happens next? And I think the next thing that happens is earnings stripping. They're going to go after that, I think, in a pretty considerable way, and that will be a significant piece of this. The thing I really want to isolate for you is what the unintended consequences of this are. Now, you might say to yourself, look, I don't like these transactions, and I'm not trying to ascribe that to you, Adrian, but let's just ascribe that to you for a second. I don't like these transactions, and so they're doing some hokey stuff on offshore cash, so good enough. We stopped them. So here is the unintended consequence that I think one should just understand and just realize, which is these rule changes apply go back to this Dan and me merger, where Dan was really tiny and puny and he was less than 20%. And these rules really only apply to 60 to 80 transactions. So the concern has become that there are legitimate M&A deals. That's when the US company is small. And then there's non-legitimate M&A deals, where the US company is relatively big. So these avoidance strategies are only now available to legitimate M&A deals. Let me put it differently. If you're a 60 to 80 deal, you can't do this stuff. Well, what is the unintended consequence of that? So what we did is we were worried about all these 60 to 80 deals, right? So the first thing we did is we said, if you're 80 plus, like you're really puny, then you can't do anything. And now we're going after the 60 to 80 deals. So one unintended consequence of this is who wins? Who's a winner from this? Big companies. Which big companies? Big foreign US companies. Sorry, big European companies, by and large, are the big winners here. So what do I mean by that? They get to undertake transactions that nobody else can transact. And it's not a surprise. We've seen a bunch of very large German transactions. Merck, AG, not Merck, whatever. The German Merck, buying medical companies. We've seen fertilizer deals, German companies buying US companies. And so the consequence of this, and this is why this world is rife with unintended consequences. You think you're making the world better by stopping sham transactions, and you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second, who just won out of this? And the answer is anybody who got in before the deadline is a huge winner, and they can acquire other companies because they're now big. And you have the foreign firms who are like, this is great, because now I understand how bad it is to be a US multinational, because all you have just shown me how bad it is. And now, if you are Siemens or whoever, you have an opportunity that you might not have had otherwise. So that's the unintended consequences that I think are rife through this entire story here. Okay, so we might end up getting to legislative remedies. I'm going to accelerate a little bit and just try to get through the rest of this. So what should happen and what might actually happen? So I'll put up my version of this. I don't think it's actually that remote from what might happen or should happen. So the first thing is it's got to be revenue neutral in the current environment. And so the question is, what does revenue neutrality mean? Revenue neutral is just a way of saying we can't spend any money on it. So you got to raise money to fund anything that costs money. And so what is that going to look like? And so the first thing is going to be a very substantial rate reduction. Now, Ken pointed out very well and very thoughtfully that we are in the worst of all worlds. We have a high statutory rate, the 35% number, and then the realized rate or the effective rate is medium to low, maybe 15, 16%. That's terrible. Why is that terrible? You're not actually getting a lot of revenue, and you're getting all the distortions of a high statutory rate. It's like a nightmare, right? But the reason he pointed out is because when corporations cry about this, they tend to focus on the statutory rate. They don't actually tend to focus on the effective rate. Either way, as a system, it's terrible because you have all the distortions, all the transfer pricing incentives, and then you don't even get the revenue that you might want to have otherwise. So I think there's a substantially reduced rate. That costs a lot of revenue. I think the other thing that can cost revenue, but not that much, is you move to true territoriality, which is a way of saying we're only going to tax income within the US. I think that's going to happen. And I'll tell you what I think should happen, then I'll tell you what I think might happen that would not be so good. That too can cost some money, but not that much money. And how do you fund all this? And I think the thing that people don't understand about the corporate tax is that it has become a tax on public companies. And so what we've seen a massive growth in is pass-through entities. And so now more than half of all business income is in non-C Corp form. That number was like, it used to be like 90% of business income was in C Corp form. And what have we seen? Basically, people getting out of C Corp form. How do you get out of C Corp form? A variety of different ways. You're familiar with them as I am. There are many, but one is you start as a partnership and you kind of grow into as a partnership. And now, of course, we have publicly listed partnerships. Blackstone being a prominent example of that. So people have figured out how to have a public listed partnership. And then two, of course, we have these kind of opco, propco transactions where you split companies and you make them into REITs and you see the growth of lots of pass-through entities, whether it's in the natural gas space or real estate or hotels. You see that happening and you actually see a lot of income going into pass-through entity form. I think you got to think about expanding the tax base beyond C corps. We're living in this world where you actually have a toll tax on becoming a public company. A serious public company are the only ones who are paying corporate taxes, and that doesn't make a ton of sense. And there's a lot of revenue there if you go after it. And then the final thing, and this is perhaps the least popular version of this, which is, and this goes to the credibility of corporations, which is corporations now routinely report very large profits to the capital markets and don't report large profits to tax authorities. And that is now de rigueur. And that, I think, is part and parcel of why people hate corporations and giving rise to something that is really not credible. So the last thing we could do is do book tax alignment, which is really have the right tax base be what you report to capital markets, which would be another big potential revenue raiser. The only thing I'll just say about what it might actually happen and would be unfortunate is some of the reforms are, we're going to go to territoriality, but we'll have an alternative minimum tax. So what does that mean? What that means is we'll only tax your income within the US, but we want to know that you paid a minimum tax somewhere. So that's curious for all kinds of reasons. So the first thing to say about that is it's kind of like a backdoor worldwide system. So what do I mean by that? If you have a 30% US tax rate and your alternative minimum tax on your foreign operations is 30%, that's the same thing as worldwide. The second thing to note is it's enormous complexity, and we know precisely what complexity costs us in this dimension, which is a lot of tax planning and not a lot of revenue. And then the third thing to worry about is why it is we care where our corporations are paying taxes. Why is it it's important for us to be taxing people otherwise? One way to think about that is if you have an alternative minimum tax, which is 20%, you've given every jurisdiction in the world a reason to jack up their rate to 20%, which doesn't make a ton of sense. That may be something that we end up seeing. I hope we don't. So I want to just take the last 15 or 20 minutes. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I think there's something to be said. I'll just say it in like 30 seconds and then move on. To me, the conundrum about tax is the following. We have seen massive corporate social responsibility efforts. Massive. Now, maybe that's genuine and maybe it's a fig leaf. I don't know. But what's surprising to me is there's no corresponding corporate tax responsibility. There's no notion of what a code of conduct might be on corporate tax. And I think if corporations want a real reform, they have to take the initiative on this. And they have to say, we have adopted something that corresponds to what CSR is. Because the conundrum is, and let's just, to pick on one company, companies who say, we do no evil, we have large CSR programs, but we're quite expert at not paying taxes in different jurisdictions. That is a conundrum. How do you think about that as a policy? Now, maybe the answer is what was being suggested about shareholders, but it is curious. We're at a place where social responsibility is highly upheld, and we're at a place where tax responsibility, there's no responsibility, basically, whatsoever. And that doesn't seem like a stable set of affairs. Okay, so that's a little bit about inversions and the corporate tax. And now I'm going to take the last 15 minutes and just, take a little bit of a flyer with you and see if you come along for the way. So the premise of this latter piece is to say inversions are just one example of something general. And it is an example of rearranging claims. And so what do I mean by that? In a simple balance sheet way, I mean we usually think about value as occurring there by investing and by doing things in more innovative ways. And financial engineering is not about that. It is about doing things over here and creating value in that way. The previous era of financial engineering, of course, was associated with securitization and Wall Street. The notion here is this era of financial engineering is occurring in the CFO office and is happening with their balance sheets. So let me try to walk you through what that means. I'm going to give you an example of it, and it's called the Slowmotion LBO of America as one example of it, but I think inversions are another. I think there's a whole bunch of things that might be categorized in this reign. Now, this is where things get a little dicey. So I think inversions are a piece of this. I think the Slowmotion LBO is a piece of it. You can think more generally about what's happening to balance sheets, right? So what have we seen? the rise of goodwill and intangible assets. We see more and more assets and liabilities that are not operating assets and liabilities. So we've seen balance sheets explode, in part because of accounting changes, which is to say goodwill that never gets amortized. We've seen deferred tax assets and deferred liabilities mushroom. And so increasingly, managers are making decisions that have large impacts on earnings that are associated with discretion on non-operating assets. And they're using that in opportunistic ways. You could think about the rising cash balances of that. You could think about declining effective tax rates. As Ken pointed out, corporations putting aside inversions have figured out how to get their claims to the governments down very, very low. These are all examples of this kind of era of financial engineering. The biggest example of it, I would argue, is this Slowmotion LBO. And I'll walk you through this quickly, and then we'll hopefully finish on time. So this is, again, these are titles that are meant to be somewhat provocative. So what's the notion of an LBO? Well, obviously the notion of an LBO is a leveraged buyout, and that leveraged buyout is a way of saying, I take a balance sheet that used to look like this. I got a bunch of cash, I got a bunch of non-current assets, plant and equipment, I got a bunch of equity, and I got a little bit of debt. And I take that company and overnight, I do what? Maybe I use some of that cash, I borrow a bunch of money, and in the morning, it looks like this. That's an LBO, that happens overnight. This is meant to imply that what's happening is just a slow motion version of that. That's either a very good thing or a very, very bad thing. So I'll try to walk you through why this is maybe a good thing and maybe why, in fact, it could be a bad thing. So, in order to do that, I want to try to characterize what's happened in the post-financial crisis era. Been a lot of attention on financial institutions. There's actually a bunch of interesting stuff happening on the real side. So what have real companies been doing? First approximation, not entirely true. 1, they've been hoarding a bunch of cash. 2, they've been more profitable than ever. 3, they ain't investing. First approximation, they ain't investing. I'll show you the data on that. 4, excluding these inversions, M&A activity has kind of been low relative to what you might have expected. Okay, so now we have a puzzle. You got a lot of cash, you're making a lot of money, and you're not investing, and you're not buying other companies. So that's a little bit of a puzzle. You have a lot of cash, you're making a lot of cash, and you're not investing. It gets even more puzzling. What do we start to see? More and more borrowing. So now things are really confusing. I have a lot of cash, I'm making a lot of cash, I'm not investing, and I'm borrowing. And the answer is, what's happening? And the answer is sharply rising share repurchase activity. You add all that up, you get that. So what do I mean by that? I'm just going to show you the data quickly and then move on to kind of what to maybe think about this. So here's the data. Corporate profits, never stronger. They're at pre-crisis levels. It's an amazing story. And the decline during the crisis was sharp, but the rebound was even sharper. This is about 30 years of data. That's just corporate profits to GDP. Corporate profitability has been amazing. Number 2, corporate investment levels have been mediocre. This is non-residential fixed investment, as a fraction of GDP. The shaded areas are recessions. And what do we see? Well, unsurprisingly, there's some cyclicality to this. But what's maybe more interesting is that after every recession, these last 2 recessions, we've come down to lower levels, and we're investing less. So lots of profits, not a lot of investment. And then, of course, cash levels are incredibly high. And we've already talked a little bit about that. And then number 3 is we actually have now seen borrowing. We've seen a lot of borrowing, and we're starting to see more and more borrowing. Some of it is very large issuers. Apple, for example, as you might have followed. They have $160 billion. They decide to do large share repurchases and large dividends. And how do they fund it? They borrow. And so we've now seen more and more borrowing. But the real icing on the cake, of course, is the remarkable rise in share repurchase activity. And so this is share repurchase activity. This is about the last 10 years of data. The blue bars are dollars. And then the red line is just the stock market. Okay, so there are a couple things to say about this. The numbers are actually, I think this understates it. If you actually looked at announcements, it's even far bigger than that. So close to 70 to 80% of firms have now announced repurchase activity. And that doesn't mean just neutralizing stock options. That means, significant share repurchase programs. The numbers are, I think, staggeringly large. I'll walk you through that in a second. What is maybe more interesting is, and just to kind of make sure, does anybody see anything interesting about this picture? Not meant to be an eye test, but there is an interesting, roughly interesting correlation. Which, Michael? I'm sorry? And is it going the way you'd expect, Michael? So the usual, we just want to understand the aggregate data. When are repurchases peaking? We don't have too many time series here, but the repurchases last peaked in 2007, which is when the stock market peaks. And repurchases last went to zero when the stock market went to zero. Is that what we'd expect? So certainly the logic and premise of buybacks is the exact opposite. So we should just keep that in mind, which is in aggregate, we don't see great timing. Part of the logic of buybacks is, I'm a CFO, I tell you, I'm undervalued. I'm buying back my shares. In aggregate, we're not seeing that. Okay?
But there's logic to this. I mean, this happened because you're in the middle of the crisis, right? You want to preserve your debt rating, you're conserving cash, the commercial paper dried up, so you don't have to.
Fair enough.
To do it.
Fair enough. Sorry, your name is?
I'm sorry, it's Charlie.
Charlie. So Charlie, fair enough. But what is? I mean, just to be crystal clear. What's the implication of this in terms of value creation and value destruction?
No, you're right.
It's pretty ugly.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Part of the borrowing, though, is because you do have companies that have, to talk about Apple, their cash is offshore.
That's right. So they borrow. And Cook said that.
that.
Cook said, I'm going to borrow. And it's not just offshore. He's getting borrowing rates of 2%.
Exactly.
This is the other artifact of QE3, right? Which is, QE has this artifact, which is they're borrowing. Why? Because Tim Cook says, I can borrow at 2%. Like, that's pretty awesome. Let's do it. But I think that just so I just want to fix ideas about numbers. So in a remarkably short period of time, the central capital allocation question that any CFO faced has shifted dramatically towards share repurchases. So if you go back 30 years, share repurchases were not necessarily a bad word, but were a very small fraction of activity relative to distributions with dividends. And so the question is that okay? And one answer is, yeah, it's okay. And the other answer is, no, it's not okay. So I'm going to try to walk you through two of those things. Just quickly, that's what this is. They're getting recapitalized. Everybody's getting recapitalized. If you want to think about the numbers, it's quite remarkable. So 3M has announced close to 30% share buybacks. So IBM has done incredible amounts of buybacks over the last 7 years. They've already retired 30% of their shares relative to where they were 8 years ago. These are very large, technologically sophisticated companies. Amgen is kind of the king of buybacks. These guys buy back shares like crazy. The reason and that again is around 30% of their shares. Now the reason to focus on these people, John Deere is another example, is, these are technological leaders. And just so we're crystal clear about it, they're saying the best thing they can invest in is their stock. And they're not doing it in small ways, they're doing it in hand over fist ways.
They're saying it's the best way. They're saying that my share owners are short-term trading, and that's what they want. I've got activists at the door who want this.
Well, so that's fair enough. I'm sorry, John?
It depends on the way you look.
Well, that's right. And
shareholders are happy, but it may not be the long term.
Well, so again, just to be shareholders are happy, think back to that value destruction story.
They're out.
Well, so let's just think about that. Who's getting value and who's getting loss? Who's losing and who's winning? I just want to make one example about this, which is kind of classic, which is Google and Apple. It's a great example, right? So we think about these as two great companies technologically. Here's what's really different about them. They're both cash machines, like unbelievable cash flow generating capacity. But what's really different about them? One is a diffuse owner, meaning Jobs never had big stake in Apple. Nobody's got a big stake in Apple. And Google's controlled by 3 guys, especially after the voting rights changed. So what do we see with their cash? It's completely different things. So Apple is under huge pressure. They ended up doing large repurchases, large dividends. They're giving back cash. Google is the exact opposite. And so the question in some larger sense is, who's going to recycle this cash? Are managers going to recycle all these cash? Or are shareholders going to recycle all the cash? And Google versus Apple is kind of one example of that. So here's, how should you think about this? And should you understand this as a good thing or a bad thing? I want to just give you 2 things to say. One is, by the way, if you think those numbers are big, maybe you don't, but their numbers are going to get larger. Because once the cash comes home from offshore, the numbers are going to be enormous. Because right now, the one mitigating factor on this is I can't access some offshore cash. If that changes, these numbers are, I think, going to explode. Okay, so hopefully you're convinced that this is a big thing. And then the question is this a good thing? So let me try to make the case for why this could be a good thing. And I'll do this relatively quickly so we can get out on time. So, could this be a good thing? And I think the answer is sure. This could be a good thing, just like LBOs can be good things. So what does that mean? If you kind of think about secular stagnation or the new normal, and you take it seriously, then you could say the following. We're entering a period of decreased growth. We're entering a period of decreased technological possibility. What is the right capital structure for that period? Answer, just like you do RJR, and just like you do an LBO on a low growth firm with low technological possibilities, that's what we're all going to live with. That's the sense in which this could be a good thing, which is it's a natural capital structure response to a new normal. That's a totally reasonable point of view. Moreover, you could even get more excited about this. It's the darn managers who are misbehaving. I don't want them doing crazy stuff with my cash. Give it back to me. You still have to address why dividends versus why repurchases versus dividends, but you can still get excited about this for that reason. And then the final thing, in fact, is repurchases offer this trifecta of nobility, which is nobody can seem to say no to them. Why? Well, wait a second, I'm giving you back your cash. That's totally what you want. Second, I'm going to do it tax efficiently relative to dividends. And then finally, I'm actually telling you I'm undervalued. So it's just impossible to resist. So the question is, could it not be a good thing? And I'm going to just try to walk you through why it might not be a good thing. You can buy into it or not. What I'm going to try to suggest is we need some more safeguards than we actually have. If you're aware of them, I would love to hear more ideas about this. So the first thing is, in some large sense, what is the crisis in America? In some large sense, it's stagnant wages. How do you get rising wages? And the answer is you get people to invest. Okay? So if you want rising wages in this country, you need more investment in this country. It's not terrible in that sense complicated, which is capital and labor, despite what you might read in recent books, are complementary. More investment is going to lead to higher rising wages. If currently we have underinvestment because people are skewing capital allocation to repurchases, that's got an aggregate effect that is problematic. Number 2, the timing picture I showed you before suggests a whole ton of value destruction. We don't know what's happening with this wave of share repurchases, but there is conceivably massive value destruction going on if people are timing this poorly. Okay? Number 3, currently share repurchases are getting close to 10% of daily volume. Now you might say, so? Well, so now the marginal buyer is the corporation, and now they're exerting price pressure. That's a little crazy. In fact, I was struck by, the recent kind of little dip we had last week. I've heard now a number of people tell me corporations were out because of quarterly earnings. They can't buy back shares. So this is getting a little crazy. These numbers are getting so large that they're actually exerting price pressure. And then the final and the most important thing to say about this is, and I'd be interested to know if you think this is true or not, which is a big chunk of this can be happening because of incentives and metrics. So the short version on this, and a couple of CFOs have said this to me, and I haven't prompted it, they haven't said this about themselves. But they have said, like, you're short a penny of EPS. How do you get a penny of EPS? And the answer is a share repurchase. It's a great way to get a penny of EPS. And by the way, I might be compensated on metrics that are highly reflecting on this. Now, that is a disaster story. So if the latter story is right, I think you should be really, really worried. And then, of course, we just have a lot of folks who are just not, everything is getting paid out, but it's all getting paid out as repurchases. Okay, so what to do? I'm going to just go through this quickly. So I'm going to just suggest a few things. I'd love to know if you think they're radical, or if they're simple, or maybe they're in place, or however you think about them. So it strikes me that there is very little guidance about these things. So, for example, the rest of the world, share repurchases are viewed as kind of dicey. And they're the way we viewed them 30 years ago, as vaguely dicey. So putting aside legal changes, the question is, do boards know what they're doing when they approve these things? And so my instinct is maybe not. They don't know what they're doing. And so I'm going to suggest a set of criteria that I think would help. So first, there should be thresholds, and they should be large for valuation gaps. By that I mean, you shouldn't be doing this when you're 10% undervalued. You should be doing this when you can demonstrate you're 30% undervalued. That'll stop a big chunk of the game playing. Boards should have independent advice. Currently, I think what is happening is CFOs are saying, here's my valuation for the company. We're 10% undervalued. We should buy back shares. That's a bad game for all kinds of reasons that I think we just mentioned. That's number one. Number two, I think if you're going to do a repurchase, the question is why we're doing them in the way we're doing them. So what are we doing? We're doing OMOs, which are open market operations, and we're doing what's even, I think, crazier, which is ASRs. So what's the ASR? ASR is Morgan Stanley comes to the CFO and says, you want to do $10 billion of a share repurchase today? We're done. So all those bad incentives get magnified like incredibly with an ASR. And it's not, and by the way, in addition, now you have a group outside the firm advocating, selling you share repurchase programs, which I think is also crazy. I think if you want to do this, there's an open, transparent way to do this, and it's called tenders. No OMOs, no ASRs, all tenders. Why? It's transparent. It's a regularized tender. You want to do it that way, you can accomplish everything you wanted to accomplish. You can do it without the funny business. So no OMOs and no ASRs. And this kind of goes to your question, John. I think the third thing to say is go back to dividends. And dividends might usefully become the default mechanism of distributing cash. There's no reason for them not to be. The usual argument against them is tax. In reality, we know that a big chunk of those tax burdens are laundered. Transactions that happen around ex-dividend days that make those things go away. So it's just not clear. Special dividends help you a ton. If you don't want the regularity of a dividend, go to a special dividend. There's all kinds of things you can do. And make that the default way of doing this. Number four, any performance contract that has any measure that can be manipulated by a share repurchase, you've got to immunize those contracts, because that is just crazy. It is the easiest way to jack up your numbers that you can imagine. So no dividend versus share repurchase decision should affect any performance contract, and you should be neutral across those, and they are not neutral across them today. And then finally, and maybe most radically, I want to see accounting for repurchases. I want to see how much value you created and how much value you destroyed by doing share repurchases. There is currently very little disclosure, and there is no accounting. So in the limit, what could you do? In the limit, you could have an accounting for the shares you bought back on a balance sheet as an investment, and you could see the value fluctuate as a financial asset. A first step would just be better disclosure. Over the last 10 years, I have bought back shares at these average prices, at these times. my cumulative return performance on my share repurchase activity is X. In the limit, let's put it on a balance sheet, and let's actually see what's happening with repurchase activity. Okay, so I've already kept you past 5 minutes. I'll just end on this stuff, and then I'm going to stick around if you guys would like to talk. On the slow motion LBO, I think we're seeing something, and it's happening in a fast way, maybe not so slow anymore. It could be great. This could be happening for great reasons. I think if you're worried about this problem, and I think you should be, there are some simple things we could do that would actually ameliorate these problems considerably. The bigger pitch would be that inversions in this are the same thing. It's a new era of financial engineering, which is CFOs figuring out how to restructure claims and paying much more attention to that. Again, that could be a good thing. New normal story, decreased growth, maybe it's fine. Or it could be a massive missed opportunity in terms of corporate investment and subsequent activity. Okay. I've already gone late. Yeah, if people want to talk, I'm happy to talk, but I don't. Any questions or things? Yes, Kingsley.
I looked at everything you said, but I'm looking at the foreign tax compliance acts. How do you strike a balance with this presentation?
Say that again, Kingsley?
The FATCA.
Oh, the FATCA?
Yeah.
Oh, well, so that's a whole different kettle of fish. So just so we're all clear about what this means is that if a number of foreign banks have stopped doing business with U.S. customers because of the reporting requirements on FATCA and the other associated consequences of FATCA, I think that's a different set of issues that are really interesting. They're affecting individuals more than they're affecting corporations, but they are very large and significant, and they're efforts to curb tax avoidance.
My question is founded on when you talk about the item that relates to economic patriotism.
Economic patriotism, yeah.
Yes, so patriotism, I also want to use another word, allegiance. What is the idea behind it? I would assume the citizenship contracts.
Yeah.
You're a citizen of the United States.
Yeah.
We provide X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, so far you remain a citizen of the United States. We own the United States.
And that is the worldwide regime. Absolutely. Just to be clear about this, Kingsley, we're pretty much the only people who do that. I think Eritrea still does it, but it's a little bit of a difficult notion. And I think the reason is, I'm not going to go into it in any depth, but the reason is, A, because we shouldn't view foreign activity as being bad. And the second reason to think about it is, we actually want not just our companies succeeding, we want the right companies to own these foreign assets. And when you have worldwide regimes competing with territorial regimes, you end up with the wrong people owning stuff. And that's a very destructive thing. I've already kept you long. Thank you so much. If you guys have comments or questions, I'm delighted to hear.